Today we are doing a bit of a regulatory spotlight into the recent White House report and the entertainingly named Inflation Reduction Act. There are some quotes that seem deeply disturbing, but are they as bad as they seem? Today we discuss. Let's jump in. Welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, Bitcoin pleb, an all-around raging capitalist, and I've been connecting some interesting dots across these couple of regulatory items, namely the recent White House report, which came out on September 8th, and then the Inflation Reduction Act, which has some interesting language that overlaps with some of the themes that we see in the former. I apologize to those of you who are not in the US. YouTube tells me that many of you are, but I know that is obviously not true for everyone. And so this will focus today on US policy, but I do think that has potentially huge implications for everyone, no matter where you are. And so one of the very triggering phrases out of the White House report is the following: should the standards prove ineffective at reducing impacts, the administration should explore executive actions, and Congress might consider legislations to limit or eliminate the use of high energy intensity consensus mechanisms for crypto mining. So that sounds pretty alarming, but what does it actually mean? What's the context here? And what is this report actually about? How does it tie into the Inflation Reduction Act? Well, those questions and more we are going to answer today, so you're not going to want to miss a thing. For those returning to the channel, welcome back, my friends. As always, it is a pleasure to have you. And for those new to the channel, I welcome you as well. If you like this type of content, I invite you to consider subscribing and join us in our growing merry gang in cyberspace. I cover all manner of Bitcoin related content, including a whole slew of tutorials on how to acquire Bitcoin, secure it, privacy best practices, running your own node, news and analysis such as today's piece, and more. You want it, I cover it. That is how this works. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the White House report and understand some of the backstory and what the report actually says. All right, so by way of context, there were a number of hearings early in the year in January that ultimately led to a March 9th executive order from the Biden administration that called for a number of different reports. So that executive order went out March 9th, calling for these different reports to be assembled. It was the case that Bitcoiners such as Troy Cross, folks at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, did submit research and documents highlighting, number one, just the benefits of Bitcoin for humanity and for society, as well as debunking a lot of the energy-related FUD that we see in the mainstream media. And so the White House's OTSP, or Office for Science and Technology Policy, was kind of the entity that spearheaded at least the first draft of this report. But if you read it, you will gather that it really is, like many of these reports, just kind of a hodgepodge of different voices, both advocates as well as critics. And these reports go through so many rounds of revision and review that you ultimately end up reading it as if it's coming from multiple different people. And that is indeed how this one reads. In any case, on September 8th, this 45-page document was published with the goal of analyzing the pros and cons of this emerging industry, which, obviously they label more broadly as crypto mining, but, that's basically Bitcoin mining, right, as the only kind of proof of work game left in town. So let's look at some of the pros and cons of this report, because believe it or not, there are some things that, these folks actually get right. And there are some silver linings as well. Keep in mind that the group of individuals writing this, these are scientists, academics, economists, engineers. And for at least some of them, this may be an honest attempt to grok and understand what is a very new industry. The other pro of this report even existing is that we now know what they're thinking. Like, we now know some of the potential concerns, risks, attack vectors, etc. So that's better than not knowing. And all in all, the report's main conclusions or action items are really just calling for more investigation. So that is encouraging, right? This doesn't lead to any policy. This is not informing any policy today, but rather highlights additional areas in which further research and investigation is warranted, which may then lead to follow-on policy actions at that time. And interestingly enough, the report does highlight some of the pieces that many of us have been hammering on for quite some time. It does acknowledge the potential role of Bitcoin in sucking up methane gas, right? What would otherwise be vented off into the atmosphere. In fact, I did a whole video recently on these different dynamics. If you are curious to check that out, I would recommend having a look at that video, because Bitcoin mining is arguably the solution to a lot of the challenges and objectives that this administration supposedly wishes to accomplish. So you would think and imagine that this is something that they should embrace. The report does at times show some impressive savviness in rejecting things like energy per transaction as a totally kind of utterly useless metric. So all in all, I think there are seemingly a couple things that have moved the needle here, but I'll come back to all of this when we have gone through the rest of today's video. Now, in terms of some of the downsides, some of the things that the report gets wrong, well, there are many of those, despite some of the pieces we just discussed. Number one, a whopping 16% of the total citations in this report are from the known misinformation spreader Alex de Vries, who works for the Dutch Central Bank. This is the individual behind Digiconomist, which has basically made it its mission to spew nonstop FUD about Bitcoin's environmental impact for the last 8 years. So that's not great, right? That a bad actor like this could really set the tone and narrative on this topic for such time. And furthermore, one of the big themes that really comes out of this report is just the extraordinary way in which Bitcoin mining seems to be, just being singled out. There are so many other industries, whether it's just simple data centers or aluminum smelting, or all sorts of things that take up way more energy than Bitcoin mining does. So it really does call into question any sort of neutrality behind this report, right? Like, is this just a charade in order to attack Bitcoin? This notion that Bitcoin mining is guilty inherently until proven innocent is just really wild to see. The report also calls for kind of efficiency standards, right? And so this calls into question, like, what does that mean? Is it kind of similar to like miles per gallon that should be achieved by a car? Like, what does that mean? Who enforces that? Do the individuals enforcing this understand the nature of proof of work? That feels like a very slippery slope. And when coupled with what we will discuss later as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, you can start to see the floodgates opened for some really concerning stuff. And then, somewhat as expected, there really is an insufficient discussion and discourse on the benefits of Bitcoin as this uncensorable, permissionless monetary network where anyone on earth can send monetary value to each other in a way that can't be confiscated, seized, etc. We shouldn't be all that surprised there. So again, check out some of the videos that I've done in the past. I will also link those in the description down below. It basically goes through like a complete debunking of some of the Alex de Vries points. There's a lot of work by Nick Carter and others that have thoroughly debunked those different points. Again, as I mentioned, there's so many industries that use way more energy than Bitcoin in a much less efficient way. So like, why is Bitcoin mining, seemingly being singled out in this fashion? The other theme that kind of creeps out of this report, and you see that in some of the rhetoric of politicians today, is this notion that energy expenditure in and of itself is a bad thing. And this is a wildly dangerous notion. There is basically a perfect correlation between energy usage per capita and any number of measures of human flourishing and prosperity and living standards. So it really is as simple as that. You want to improve people's living standards, you need to increase energy usage per capita. That is the way to do it. Like, there is nothing else more effective than that. Furthermore, the idea of banning proof of work is just like pretty outrageous. That's going to get picked up somewhere else, right? So like, all you've done is shut your own kind of economy out to something that could help add jobs, add to GDP, all this good stuff. And we saw that quite abundantly clearly with, the way that China cracked down on mining. And a lot of those miners came to the US. Hilariously, I think the EU is further along in their journey of analyzing some of this stuff. And at one point they were talking about banning proof of work mining, but it seems like they kind of came to that realization that like, oh, we're just sort of shooting ourselves in the foot. If we do that, it's going to go elsewhere. And so now they're talking more about restricting the trading and potentially even hodling of proof of work cryptocurrencies. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in that absolute hellhole that is the EU going forward. Now, I see a lot of people commenting on this and what we've just discussed, but I haven't seen a lot of people drawing connections to other legislation such as the Inflation Reduction Act. So this was signed into law on August 16th, basically a slimmed down version of, the Build Back Better plan that you've, heard propagate through the World Economic Forum and all its minions. And at a high level for the US, this basically includes setting a minimum, corporate tax rate, drug price reform, massively increasing the funding for the IRS, which we saw, a lot of kind of news coverage on, extending some of the healthcare subsidies, and then these kind of gigantic investments in just like all sorts of stuff, including a lot of energy and climate related things. And so this last piece is what I am interested in connecting the dots on. And I will put the link to this entire thread in the description down below. For those not familiar, Alex Epstein has written books and does research on, the merits of fossil fuels, right? And the sort of caution around moving away from them more quickly, which I think has a lot of validity to it. And he goes through these kind of 12 myths about this, Inflation Reduction Act. And it's actually a very, very, very good thread. So again, I would encourage you to read through it. But the piece that really stands out to me is what he describes here, this kind of provision within the IRA that gives anti-fossil fuel bureaucrats and activists a new level of destructive power via language that authorizes the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to restrict any activity that emits CO2, which is literally everything. There's the meme that, the carbon they want to reduce is which means anything the administration wants under the Section 15 of the Clean Air Act. So this is exactly the type of kind of arbitrary power that leads to these slippery slopes. People say, conspiracy theory or, blah, blah, blah. But this is exactly how it starts. And so taking a step back, looking at what we've reviewed now in totality, is it possible that the government is doing an honest inquiry into Bitcoin mining? Yes, I actually think it's possible. Is it probable? Is it likely that they're doing an honest inquiry? Absolutely not. So it remains to be seen where this all goes and where the battle lines ultimately get drawn. But I do think we are now officially on this conveyor belt that is moving ever closer to some truly ludicrous policies. If I'm wearing my tinfoil hat, I might even hypothesize that this report, which seems kind of balanced, is merely so to placate everyone and sort of lull people into a false sense of security of like, okay, well, they're at least, doing this kind of honest inquiry and hopefully, they don't crack down. There are these kind of purposefully vague, unquantifiable threats. And so on net, I think skepticism here is absolutely warranted. So, if you're a US miner, I think you at least want to have some sort of contingency plan, right? Even if it's a tail risk, the probability of that tail risk, I do think is increasing. And so what are potential other geographic options for your miners? At least have a backup plan. Consider home mining. Yes, it's possible. Yes, it's profitable. There's a ton of FUD in that regard, even within the Bitcoin community as well. I've often cited some of Econo Alchemist's great writing and work on this. But the benefit of home mining is you just dramatically increase the number of enforcement points, right? You make the mining network more durable and decentralized. So I think a war is coming. I think there could easily be a facade here of honest inquiry. It remains to be seen, and I will be very happy to be proven wrong. But net, given all the evidence before us thus far, I think skepticism remains the proper stance. With all of that, let's go ahead and conclude today's video. All right, so we took a slightly closer look at the recent White House report and the Inflation Reduction Act, at least some of the interesting, relevant excerpt from that piece of legislation. And there are some of you watching this, and I know that there's a lot of this kind of attitude within the community that, why are we even entertaining this? Why do we even care? Why are we even, fighting on their terms, right? That's bending the knee. And I totally get that argument, but I equally think it's disgusting to just let enemies of Bitcoin completely set the narrative about this entire topic. Combating those false narratives with truth is not bending the knee. If we ignore all of this and just say Bitcoin's inevitable, it doesn't matter, we let other people set the narrative for our children and their children's children. Now, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. I don't think we should grovel and apologize for anything, but rather fervently offer up the truth to any who will listen. And if they don't, then that's then it is what it is. But how far are you willing to go to protect the network? We got to be willing to get muddy every now and then, and I think this is going to be one of those battles where that is absolutely necessary. I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments down below. Do you think all of this is overblown, or do you think we are on a very slippery slope? Let me know what you think, but I hope you found this valuable and informative. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath to get this to more folks. That really does help get this in front of more people, raise awareness of these important issues. If you're so enamored with this content and you'd like to donate to the channel to enable me to continue to do these types of videos, I will have my Lightning address, Strike username at the very end page of the video. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave this here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, my friends, I'll see you then.